Just a reminder that this is a class for the general public, even though it's hosted by Brigham Young University and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. If you have any questions specific about the church, if you will put those in the chat, the missionaries will try to answer those. So, Sister Stoddard, we will turn the time over to you if you would like to share your screen.
Great, just give me 1 second. Okay, so just brief introduction to myself. Thank you for the introduction already, Brother Farnsworth, Elder Farnsworth. I live in Orem, Utah, and I received a bachelor's in family history from BYU in 2009. I've worked as a professional genealogist since that time, and I currently work for a company called Legacy Tree Genealogists doing DNA research. I started getting into DNA about 7 or 8 years ago when testing, more people started doing testing, especially the autosomal DNA testing, which is mostly what I'll be talking about in this webinar. There are some other types of DNA testing as well, but I've had a lot of opportunities to teach about DNA and DNA testing and help people with it. And one of the things I've realized is a lot of people, even people who are genealogists who've done decades of research, they may have different levels of familiarity with DNA or knowledge gaps or, levels of experience that are different. Even sometimes people who have had it themselves or a family member tested, they don't always know all the things they can do with their test results. So hopefully after this class, you'll know a little bit more about that and also just a little bit more about how DNA works in general. And as I said, this presentation will mostly be focused on autosomal DNA, but I'll talk a little bit about the other types as well. So in order to talk about what a DNA test is, we need to understand just some basics about what DNA is. I'm not a biologist or a scientist, and so I'm not going to be real sciencey here, but I'll give you a little bit of that, and I'll give you some details about how a DNA test works, how you take it, why you might want to take it, and who should take a test. And that's an especially important question to be asking if you're trying to use DNA to answer a particular question about your family history. So in a very basic definition, DNA is the code that tells your body how to be you. The previous slide, it had some humans and some animals on it. It's because there's a point to that. Every living thing has DNA, even viruses have DNA. It's in each cell of an organism, and it has the instructions that tell a living thing how to develop, function, grow, and reproduce. And each letter used for DNA code, the A, G, C, and T, they stand for different nucleic acids that contain the instructions to help a living thing do everything it needs to do. And these letters can be combined in different ways and can tell your body how to grow an ear, how to circulate blood, what color your hair is. And it can control things that change over time even, such as how fast you grow, whether you get facial hair, or if you get gray hair, or if you totally lose your hair. So lots of things DNA can do. Now, most of our DNA is not unique to us. Most of it is like other living things on the earth. Between 40 and 60%, I've seen different numbers of your DNA is identical to a banana. About 99% of it is identical to that of a chimpanzee. And 99.9% of your DNA is identical to that of other humans, which that then takes us to the question of what is a DNA test going to tell us about how we're different from other humans, and how does it do that? So what DNA tests do is they focus on those genes that vary between different humans rather than the ones that all humans share, all living things share even. There's 3 types of tests that will measure some of these unique portions of our DNA. A Y-DNA test is a test that only males can take because it's on the Y chromosome, and it is only passed from father to son down through the generations. And it changes slowly, which means you can use Y-DNA to even investigate direct male line relationships that are hundreds or thousands of years back. mtDNA also changes at a slow rate, though it's a little more variable as to the rate at which it changes. It stands for mitochondrial DNA, which is a part of your cells that you only inherit from your mother. Sometimes I like to use the term umbilical cord line because that's easy for people to think of, you know, who did I used to be connected to by an umbilical cord? That's who you got mtDNA from. Both men and women inherit it, but only women pass it on. And then there's autosomal DNA, which is the kind most people are the most familiar with, and that I will be talking about the most in this presentation. That's the DNA that you get half of from each parent. So autosomes, that's just a term for your 22 chromosomes. And so those are the chromosomes, you know, you get one from your mother, one from your father. And then autosomal DNA tests don't actually look at all the DNA on each autosome. They look at certain parts, certain genes on each of the autosomes. And this is the main kind of DNA test people take that's a consumer DNA test. So if someone's taken an ancestry DNA test, it's an autosomal DNA test. And there's several other kinds out there, but that's a kind that males or females can take. And just a few little facts about autosomal DNA. Some of these more unique genes that autosomal DNA investigates, they have specific jobs that, you know, make two people different from one another. Your eye color, whether you can digest milk or not. There's also some genes that are more commonly found in certain populations than others, which is how ethnicity predictions are created by these testing companies. And some of the genes that they look at when they're doing autosomal DNA testing, they don't actually know yet what they do, but they know that they vary a lot between different people, and so that helps you be able to tell two DNA samples apart from each other. So they sample a lot of genes when they do autosomal DNA testing. Between 450,000 and 750,000 highly variable data points. And by highly variable, it means these are likely to differ between different people. They are the genes that change more, that there's just more variety of in the human population. And then they determine your matches by comparing your data on those data points to that of others who've also tested and had those same, you know, hundreds of thousands of data points tested. And this chart kind of breaks it down roughly by percentages of how many of these data points they'd expect you to share with a given relationship. So, you know, if you're an identical twin, you're going to be identical at all of those points. If it's a parent or a child you're comparing yourself to, it's going to be about half of those points in common, half of them not. And the further back your common ancestry is, the less of this kind of DNA you're going to share. And really, autosomal DNA, most of the time, it can be useful for verifying relationships 6 or 7 generations back at most. Beyond that, it gets a little bit hit and miss, and even sometimes before that, it's a little bit hit and miss just because of how much random reshuffling DNA goes through. So the way to take a DNA test, it's pretty simple. The process is pretty similar no matter what company you test with. You have to order a kit. It's usually either a spit in a tube or a cheek swab process, which I've been involved in cases where the person that they're trying to get to test, often it's someone who's older or not in good health. They can't produce enough spit to do a spit test. And so there are some companies that will do a cheek swab test that actually samples cells from your cheek. And then once you take the test, or even before that, you need to register your kit with the testing company. That way they'll email you, notify you, let you know when the test results are ready, and you can have a line of communication if you have any questions, or if you're still not seeing your results, you're having any issues. So then that's when you mail your kit to the laboratory after you've registered the kit, not before, or else you may not have the information you need to register it. And then it usually takes about 6 to 8 weeks to get results. I've seen them faster, I've seen them slower. Sometimes it just depends on how quickly things are going at the company. I mean, sometimes after a big holiday, Christmas or something, it takes longer because there's a lot of people sending their kits in. So choosing a company to test through, there are a lot of different companies, different tests out there on the market. I mean, really, there's probably hundreds of them, but I'm going to talk mostly just about the big 5 because they're the most established, have a good reputation, probably aren't going away, testing companies, and they're the most likely places you're going to find matches. And that's really what, I mean, lots of people could probably give you an ethnicity estimate by sampling your DNA. But if you're wanting to do family history research, what is way more useful is the matches. And so you need to know, okay, where am I going to test so I can find matches? And sometimes the match you're hoping to find may be tested somewhere else, but I'll talk a little bit more about that because sometimes you may have to take multiple tests, but some companies do allow you to transfer results from other companies into their database. So these major test companies, 23andMe, Ancestry.com, Family Tree DNA, Living DNA, MyHeritage DNA. The 3-in-1 test refers to not only will they tell you who you match in the database and give you an ethnicity estimate, but they will give you a haplogroup prediction for mitochondrial DNA and also a Y haplogroup prediction if you're male. It's not as detailed of information as if you took a standalone Y or mitochondrial DNA test, but it will tell you some information that might be helpful. So 23andMe there, I put the cost is $99 or $199 because they have 2 main test options you can take. One of them, the more expensive one, includes health data as well, whereas the less expensive one is just the matching and the haplogroup predictions. Family Tree DNA and MyHeritage DNA do also have some health products, but there's a few different options and different prices with each option, and so I would advise you, if you're curious about that, to look those things up on their websites. The size of a database may influence your choice as of where to test. Like, if you're wanting to get the most possible matches, you're going to probably want to test somewhere that has a larger database. But I have also worked on research cases where the most important match or the closest match wasn't at one of the big databases, it was at one of the smaller databases. And sometimes this can be affected by your particular ancestry and where certain tests are sold or available in other countries, or what's more popular. So for example, MyHeritage is not the largest test database out there, but their kit has been available historically in places that sometimes Ancestry is not available, and they're also just more commonly used in Europe. And so if I have somebody who has recent European ancestry or ancestry from a country where Ancestry doesn't offer a test, then MyHeritage is a good one for them to do. But the allows external transfers was what I was talking about earlier, where if you've taken a 23andMe test and you'd like to see what matches you might have in another database, you can download your raw data from 23andMe and you can transfer it into one of the other three at the bottom, family tree DNA, living DNA, or MyHeritage DNA. Same with Ancestry. Ancestry will let you take your results and transfer them into one of those other three databases. However, it doesn't work in reverse. You cannot take MyHeritage results and transfer them into 23andMe and Ancestry. So that's something to consider when you're thinking about which tests might I want to get, or how many of them, and how do I want to be able to maybe do what I always suggest people do, which is fish in as many ponds as possible. So you may have already taken a DNA test, and maybe you already had some reasons to do it, or you may be wondering, why do I want to take a DNA test? Or, you know, is the reason I want to, would DNA testing help with this? So there are some people that will do the tests that include the health packages, because that's what they're curious about. They're curious about health risk, and, you know, especially if you don't have a lot of known on paper family history of what your family health history is, that might be really interesting to you. I have a relative who's an adoptee who did DNA testing and did some health stuff, and we found out that she's pretty young, but that she has a predisposition to some nut allergies, which she doesn't currently have nut allergies, but that was interesting and possibly helpful to know that, yeah, that's something I may need to watch out for. A lot of people are curious about their ethnicity. Where did my ancestors come from? Especially in the US, where a lot of, you know, there's been a lot of immigration. People have come from a lot of different places. There isn't always good record of where did my ancestors come from. That's something that people are really curious about. I've had occasion to visit with some researchers from Germany, because I do some German research as well, and they're just a little bit puzzled, the ones I talked to at least a few years ago, about why you would do a DNA test. But, you know, from their personal perspective, it's like, well, all of my ancestors have been in Germany for the past 1,000 years, so I'm not really curious about that. So to talk a little bit more about ethnicity science and how it works, I get a lot of questions from people about ethnicity because it's interesting and people are curious about that. Scientists will take DNA samples from local people, and by local people, usually the criteria is something like, your entire family has lived right here in this area for 3 generations or more. Their standards may vary a little bit, but that's a kind of a general idea of how they might do that. And then they study the samples of these local people and try to figure out what markers are there on their DNA that is unique to that population, that we're seeing a lot of people from this area having this particular combination of genes. And so this can reflect, you know, when you're comparing yourself to this population, you may not have had ancestors that lived in the area recently, but maybe 100 or 200 or more years ago, your ancestors could have lived in that area. And if that were the case, you may match people from that area on those unique genes. And this map I have here just kind of shows, as of last week when I looked it up, these are some of the regions that the Ancestry DNA test will predict for people. So if you have ancestors in Puerto Rico versus ancestors in Cuba, it kind of looks like they've gotten to the point of being able to kind of tell the difference between that. And so it is something that is evolving, changing as people get more data, the researchers get more data in the database, more samples, they're able to make more specific predictions. And the predictions kind of have changed over time, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And also in a future webinar, I'll get into that a little bit more. So, like I said, they do the sampling process, and they also go through an averaging process. They don't look at every one of those 750,000 genes when they're trying to make an ethnicity prediction. They kind of sample and look at certain ones that they know usually have some of these markers that are unique to different ethnic populations. And so they may run the DNA through this sampling process, you know, 1,000 times or whatever it is. And then they take an average of all of those sampling runs. One of the sampling runs, you might have come up 25% Scandinavian based on the genes that they looked at. And then another time you might have come up 40% Scandinavian. They average that. And another thing that's important to remember is you, just like anything else, you don't inherit ethnicity markers or any genes evenly from ancestors beyond your parents. So I may have gotten certain things from my paternal grandfather that my sister did not get, as far as coloring or our height, and the same goes with your ethnicity markers. So this is just kind of an example of, even as you go to different companies, because they may have different reference populations they're working with or different ways that they sample the DNA, you can get different ethnicity predictions from different companies. So this is the same person. This is one of my grandparents. And when I put her test results on MyHeritage, I actually transferred them. It said, okay, she's 50.1% Southern Europe, 49.9% North and West Europe, and it tried to break it down further from there. Now, I happen to know that this grandparent, she's half Portuguese. So the South Europe, it does make sense, kind of. I don't think she's got anybody recently in her tree that's Italian, but it's pretty close. The Scandinavian part, I don't know of any Scandinavian ancestry she has, but that was their best estimate based on the populations they were comparing to. And then Ancestry.com, it actually didn't put her Iberian, her Southern Europe, Portugal, and Spain up quite as high. It predicted more Ireland and Scotland. And then, Ancestry picked up a trace amount of African ancestry that MyHeritage didn't. Another thing that Ancestry and some of the other companies have started to do is to do communities. So it's not just on a country level or a region level. They're trying to predict, okay, were your ancestors part of a specific group? And some of that, at least the way Ancestry does it, is based on comparing people in their system and what their trees say and what their DNA say. It's a little bit complicated, but it's really interesting how they've done that, to where, this is pretty accurate for my grandmother. Her mother was Portuguese who lived in Hawaii. Her parents were immigrants to Hawaii from Portugal. And so that's her mother's side. And then her father was from the Carolinas. He came to Hawaii during the Second World War with the Navy. So if I had no idea where my grandma's family came from, this would give me some really good clues to start with. Now, as I said before, you don't inherit things the same as your relatives do from your mutual ancestors. Some get more of this, some get more of that. So this set of results on the left is my sister and myself, and what our current ethnicity percentages are. And then on the right is my daughter's results against my half Portuguese grandmother's results. Now you see the numbers are a little different than on the slide before of how much Portuguese they're predicting her to be now. These are all from Ancestry, but they've updated their estimates in the past year. So if my daughter were to look at just her DNA results, she wouldn't know from looking at that she has a great-grandmother that's half Portuguese, because she didn't wind up with any of that. She also wouldn't know that she has recent German ancestors or recent ancestors from Newfoundland, Canada. But if she goes and looks at her DNA matches and their attached trees, that is where she could still get that information from. And there would be some really clear patterns there with those ancestral locations I mentioned. So this brings me to my next point of why you would take a DNA test for family history research reasons. With myself and my husband, we didn't necessarily have any major unanswered questions in our tree. But, you know, there's some of our lines that we don't have as much paper trail information on. And so DNA has been helpful to at least confirm that we're DNA matches to other people that also claim the same ancestor. Like, the DNA is further proof that we're already on the right track with our paper trail research. One of the things that I've really enjoyed with DNA research too is it's allowed me to connect with relatives who are also interested in family history that I never probably would have connected with otherwise. I now communicate regularly with a third cousin that I never would have known had he not DNA tested, and I and some of my family members DNA tested. We've been able to exchange photos and family stories and, you know, cool things that the other part of the family had that we didn't end up with. So then there's the question that one of our group members asked before the class started, is about using DNA to solve a mystery such as an adoption and other kind of mystery in your family tree where you've got one of those lines on your pedigree chart that you cannot fill out. And so adoption's one good example of that. Sometimes you just have a brick wall. You might know who your grandpa is, but you don't know where he came from. You don't know who his parents are. It's a mystery beyond him. Or misattributed parentage, which is a term that means the parents are not who you expected them to be, of yourself or of the person you're studying. Adoption can be one reason for this. Sometimes there's formal legal adoption. Sometimes there's informal adoptions, often within a family or a social group. It could be a step-parent raised a child as their own, even though it was their spouse's child and not theirs. And then there's also illegitimacy. Sometimes it's known and sometimes it's a surprise when it's found out. I was recently working on a case where the person I was researching for wanted me to use DNA to try and figure out who his third great grandmother's family was, which is kind of far back and you have to use really small amounts of DNA to try and figure that out. And it's difficult. But as I started working and looking at his different matches and trying to figure this out, I came to the conclusion that there may be someone earlier in the line whose parentage was misattributed, and that person is between him and the third great grandmother, which means we probably cannot use his DNA to figure out who third great grandmother and her family were. So, you know, I think the health stuff is interesting. I think it's still a developing science. I really also kind of view ethnicity as helpful, and it can be a clue, but it's still kind of a developing and ever-changing target really as well. But the match data and the ability for you to connect with people that share a certain amount of DNA with you, meaning they are a genetic relative of some kind, that science is the most reliable, you know, more so than even the health or the ethnicity. And that's because it's math. You share 50% of your unique DNA with a parent or a child. And then beyond that, it does get a little bit variable, but it still falls within known scientifically studied amounts that you share with a sibling or a first or a second cousin. So just a chart that has some basics of the average amount of DNA that you would share with a particular relationship. As I've said before, parent-child is 50%. Now, CM stands for centimorgans, and it's a measurement that they use to talk about amounts of shared DNA, but it's not actually amounts, it's more of a probability number, and I'm not going to get into what the long definition of that is now, but it's just I just use these numbers as the math of, 3,400, that's a parent-child relationship. And then knowing the numbers down from there, I've worked with these enough that I'm just familiar with them, where if I see someone sharing 1,700 centimorgans of DNA with a person, I'm like, okay, is this their half-sibling? Is this their aunt? Is this their grandparent? Because it has to do with getting half of your DNA from your parent, but then if there's another recombination event beyond that of, grandparent, you're only going to have about a quarter with, and so on and so forth. Which I have some links at the end as well. This is a simplified version of some of these statistics, but I have some links where you can learn more about these shared DNA amounts. Some companies will tell you the shared DNA amount in CMs, in centimorgans, whereas others will tell you in percentages. And another thing to remember is beyond about second cousins once removed, third cousins, there are cases where you won't share DNA with a known third cousin or fourth cousin, and the odds of that happening gets higher the further out the relationship gets. Another thing you have to take into consideration when you're looking at the DNA amount you share with a person is, do I or this person have ancestry from an endogamous population? Now, endogamy means a population that has only married or had children within that population for generations. It could be because of religion, it could be because of geographic isolation or cultural differences. So Ashkenazi Jews, which is Eastern European Jews, that's an example of a population that has a lot of endogamy because most people in that population only married or had children with other people within that population for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so if you have ancestry from that population, your numbers are going to be a little bit higher because you may be fifth cousins 6 different ways. And another thing that can also affect this, which is kind of similar to endogamy but more recent, is if there's any kind of double relationship. So double cousins is when 2 siblings from one family marry, have children with 2 siblings from another family. My second great-grandfather and his brother both married the Cornell girls that lived up the road. And so their children were double cousins, and they shared more DNA with one another than your average first cousins would because of that double relationship. So yeah, just look out for that and adjust your expectations accordingly if you end up with ancestry from a double relationship or an endogamous population. So there's some limits. DNA is not going to be able to solve every research question. If your relatives haven't tested or didn't test through the same company as you, they're not going to be your match. I've heard of people who don't quite get this concept who are like, well, I tested and I didn't find my sibling on there. Well, if your sibling didn't test, they're not going to be in there. It's not going to happen. Your matches may not answer their messages or sign into their account regularly, so you could have a great match on the website, but they don't always respond for various reasons. Even if you do have a good match, you might have to do some work to figure out how you and they are connected, especially if you both have mysteries in your family tree, or if the relationship's really far back. Because if the relationship's really far back, that just, it doubles every generation which ancestors you could possibly share with, third cousins, and then fourth cousins, and then fifth cousins. The number of ancestors you have that you could potentially share with them doubles every time. And the further back your research question is, the less likely that autosomal DNA will be helpful, because there are a lot of recombination events between you and an ancestor 7 generations back. And so that means you and another descendant of that ancestor are less and less likely with each generation to have inherited the same chunk of DNA from that same ancestor. So who tests? A lot of it depends on what question you're trying to answer with DNA. Test yourself if you're interested in you're curious about your own ethnic heritage or your family tree. Your parents can be useful to test to sort maternal and paternal side matches. So you may just have a question on one side of your family. Say it's on your dad's side. It's still helpful to test your mom or someone on her side of the family, because then that allows you to see which matches are shared with your mom, and therefore they're probably not relevant to what you're trying to figure out about your dad's side. Same thing with a half sibling or an aunt uncle. That can help filter and sort your maternal from your paternal matches. Another good one to test is the oldest relative in a particular family line, because if you have questions about one of their ancestors, you're going to get more DNA representing that ancestor from someone that's an older generation than you. They will have more of that person's DNA. I was really lucky when all of this testing became available, because all 4 of my grandparents were still alive, and all the 4 of them were willing to test for me. And so I sent them all test kits. And I honestly rarely even look at my own test results, because I can look at my grandparents, and that divides up my matches in a really nice way, and I can learn more about their ancestors than I would just looking at my own test results. Now, if my grandparents had not all been living, my next step would have been to try to find a sibling of one of my deceased grandparents, or maybe a niece or nephew of one of my deceased grandparents, because that person then would also represent just that quarter of my tree. And I actually used this method of testing my grandparents to work on a mystery in my grandma's family tree. Her dad's father is unknown. He was born to a mother who was not married, and he's deceased, and his wife is deceased. But having my grandma, their daughter, test, I was able to work on figuring out who that unknown grandfather of my grandmother was. I actually had a sort of an easy scenario to work with, because my grandma, she's the one who's half Portuguese. It was pretty easy to tell which matches were from her Portuguese side. And then I just was able to look at her father's Carolina's ancestry, and I knew who his mother was. And so I was able to spend time on figuring out which matches were from his mother's side. And then that last quarter of the matches that was left in my grandma's match list was through his unknown father's side. Now, I haven't quite solved that one yet, but I've gotten it narrowed down to a family that lived in the area. Now, I was going to give just one other example of how you can kind of use targeted testing in a situation like this. I was on the other end of this one time, where I also had my grandpa test, and he came up as a first cousin match to somebody he did not know. And so we communicated with her. We eventually learned she was an adoptee, and when she was born and where she was born, and we figured out it was on his mom's side of the family, and that she was probably the child of one of his mom's sisters. But his mom had a lot of sisters. She did get some information from the adoption agency that told how old her mother was when she was born, and that her mother was a twin. Luckily, her mom was, the set of twins that was in the family, they were fraternal twins. They were deceased. Their children were actually deceased as well. So we had grandchildren of each of the twins test and figured out which one shared more DNA with this woman who was an adoptee, who was given up for adoption over 80 years ago. And we were able to get her the answer of who her biological mother was in the family. So just some advice: if you have tested, if you're waiting on test results, in the meantime, you can attach a family tree to your DNA results, or your account, or work on building a family tree. That way, when you get results, you can start comparing it to other people. Now, not every website will let you attach a family tree, but a lot of them will. And I tell people, even if you're just going to look at it once and walk away, even if you just attach a family tree that shows who your grandparents or great grandparents are, that could be really helpful to somebody out there who is searching for answers. When you get your results, if you're not sure what to do with them, there are lots of ways to get help with interpreting the results or working on a research question you might have. There are volunteers and missionaries at the BYU Family History Library that can help. There are also online groups, Facebook groups, and things like that where you can learn more about DNA research and ask questions. And another thing that I advise you to do, especially if you're trying to figure out some kind of mystery, is to do what transfers you can to those companies that do allow transfers. I just have some helpful links at the end here of some good places you can go to start learning more about DNA research. And I'd be happy to pass those along for a handout because I know they like to have handouts from these classes. And I'm ready for any questions. If I haven't looked at the chat, so I'm not sure how many questions we might have, but I'm happy to answer some. Let's see. Okay, Robert, I'm trying to understand your question here. I'm guessing it's on one side of your family, but that you have the Japanese ancestry, but you're not sure where it came from. But yeah, that's a clue to start with. Sounds like you have a little bit of a mystery there. I'd be curious to hear more about that. Okay, Robin's son took a DNA test. Yeah, so the ethnicity percentages usually are not going to tell you if somebody is Australian, but the fact that you're seeing that a lot of, because Australia's a lot like the US. There are native peoples of Australia, the indigenous tribes of Australia, but most Australians, like most Americans, have recent immigration from other places in their trees. But the fact that you're seeing a lot of Australian matches, that means he probably either has somebody recent in his family from Australia, or maybe his family was from England or something, and some of them went to Australia, so he has cousins there. As far as trying to contact matches, if you've got a question and you don't know the answer, that's a good place to start. There are some different guides online of what are the right kinds of questions to ask and how to approach people. I generally advise people to start with something very general. Hey, it looks like we're a match. Can you tell me more about your family tree? I'd like to figure out how we're related. Sometimes on MyHeritage, they already will have family trees attached. You do have to sometimes pay an additional fee at MyHeritage to be able to see people's family trees. But if there are family trees, I'd look at that first before I even contact people to try and see, can I see a pattern? Can I see a pattern of a last name or a town or anything like that that might give me some clues? Okay, yeah. Somebody whose wife passed away and has matches that are matching her at 1,000 plus centimorgans. Oh, I'm not sure if what you're referring to is people that have over 300 matches or the centimorgan amounts. I'd have to look at this woman's results to kind of know what you're looking at. But if she did not know her family, a match of 1,000 centimorgans more, that's a close relative. That's, possibly a first cousin or a half sibling or a niece or nephew. So if it is really over 1,000, that's significant. An unknown great-great-grandfather. Yes, a Y DNA test if the line between you and that great-great-grandfather is all through men. Like if your last name is, or your father's last name is Collins, and that's all the way up his Collins line, then he would be the right person to take a Y DNA test. If it's not directly through the male line, you would have to find a direct male descendant of that ancestor whose father was in question. You could also do autosomal DNA testing on your father, because that would be his great-grandfather, and he So it's, yeah, you still might be able to get some information from autosomal testing of your father as well on that mystery parent in his line. Okay. Yeah, maybe I will add to the helpful links. I'll add some links to some places that have examples of kinds of questions you can ask. Like I said, some people don't get on their accounts very often, Robin, to check their messages, or they're busy or whatever it is. And so sometimes they will answer, sometimes they won't. Sometimes you can use their username, or if they put their family tree information on, even if they never respond to you, you can sometimes figure out who they are, who their ancestors are, by seeing what they put on their profile in a testing company. Okay, so this is your daughter, and it says you and your daughter share 300 plus centimorgans. That's not a, I haven't seen ancestry results reported that way before with a plus sign, so I would have to see what you're looking at, because I'm not sure if you're looking at the total centimorgans or the largest segment, or which data you're looking at. Okay, so for Y-DNA testing, I will talk more about Y-DNA testing in my next webinar, but Family Tree DNA is the company that does Y-DNA testing. So if you want the full Y-DNA testing experience, Family Tree DNA is the place to go for that. And they have different levels of testing that are more or less precise. In a case like this, where you're not sure if you're going to get matches or not, you could start at one of the lower levels of testing, and they keep your sample. And so if you get some good matches and you want to compare more closely with them, they have the option to pay more later to get more information about your Y results. Just waiting to see if there's any other questions. Like I said, Robin, I will add to this helpful links list. So I'll add some links to, the kinds of questions you might ask potential DNA matches, cousins, or close relatives when you're trying to solve a mystery such as an adoption. Okay, Robert says he has some third cousin matches, so that could be helpful for the question you're trying to solve, is to reach out to those matches or figure out who their grandparents and so forth are. Sometimes people, if you just ask them how I'm connected, they don't know. But if you can ask them a more specific question, like, who are your grandparents? Where did they live? About when they were born? Those are questions that people often know the answers, or at least part of the answers to.